March 21st, 2021. I'd like to talk together with you this morning about Chacham Ovadia Yosef and changing what we do. Now, this, of course, is a topic and a theme which has recurred over the course of many classes from different vantage points. In recent weeks, we've gone a little bit in different directions in terms of analyzing the development of halacha, but in the specific class this week, I just wanted to bring forth a potpourri of vantage points of sources that I've come across recently, and they need to be mentioned. They need to be mentioned in terms of fleshing out the full idea over the course of time, in terms of what we've discussed on so many occasions, and that is when you're analyzing specifically halacha, but I imagine in any law system, there are two primary, in my mind, directions within which you can walk. One is you can be textual, which means to say you'll trace the way that the law should be practiced, the custom should develop, back to the initial sources, developing it forward and understanding where and how it should have been and correcting it if it's not there. Alternatively, there's what we've alternatively described as just what we do, or the mimetic tradition, as Chaim Soloveitchik termed it in his Rupture and Reconstruction. It's the nohag, I imagine, is what people would say in Hebrew. It's the minhag avotenu torahu. The minhag oftentimes, if not always, establishes the halacha. Now, that can't be in a vacuum, of course. It has to be textually supported. But as we know, within halacha, within most systems, there are ways of supporting contradictory statements, different approaches to matters. And the question is, in the context of halacha, what is, quote, the right approach? What is the dominant approach? And we've discussed there are different vantage points and different views on this matter. Primarily, we've discussed Chacham Ovadia Yosef as being a champion of the way it should be, and the textual approach, which means to say, even if there's a widespread minhag, even if it's developed and existed over the course of 100, maybe even 1,000 years, Chacham Ovadia Yosef will say time and again, there are notable exceptions, but he'll generally speaking say, rip it up, tear those pages out of your halacha books, and redo this. Now approach the halacha in a new fashion, the way, quote, it should be, or it should have been. So I'd like to bring forth three specific examples toward developing Chacham Ovadia Yosef's opinion on this matter. In the latter two, we'll contrast it, as we often do, to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's approach on those two specific issues. The first one is to give you a perspective, and I'll explain as we get to the first one. Is not a great example, but it's good for developing this point. The first one came up most recently because on these daily halachot that I'm recording, almost daily, I discussed the halacha with regards to lechem mishneh, having 2 loaves of bread or 2 pita breads at the meals on Shabbat. Additionally, I talked about having and eating 3 meals on Shabbat. And more specifically, I addressed what is the obligation or exemption, what is the law of women with regards to both lechem mishneh and shalosh se'udot on Shabbat. I cited on the page over here as well, in source number 1, Ran. Ran is Rabbeinu Nisim of Gerona. He's he makes his way to Barcelona as well. He's a 14th century Spanish rabbi, of course, and he's in turn citing from Rabbeinu Tam, a 12th century French rabbi, Rabbi Yaakov ben Meir, the grandson of Rashi. So Rabbeinu Tam, who's to the best of the halachic system, the first one to directly address this issue in writing, he has it in his book called Sefer HaYashar, and he's cited widely by the Rishonim. He states unequivocally that women are obligated both in lechem mishneh on Shabbat and as well in the 3 meals. What's his rationale? What's his reasoning? The Rishonim quote one reason. In Sefer HaYashar, he actually adds an additional reason. The reason that the Rishonim mention, just briefly, is that women were a part of the miracle of the man. Lechem mishneh, of course, is to commemorate the fact that we got double portions of man on Friday as opposed to on Shabbat when no man fell. The 3 meals are derived by the rabbis as well in Masechet Shabbat from the fact that the word hayom hayom is used in the context of the man 3 times. The rabbis in each of these matters say, well, we have an obligation to have double portions of bread and additionally to have 3 meals. Since women were a part of sustaining themselves, getting that sustenance from man, they too are obligated in these mitzvot. That's the claim of Rabbeinu Tam. He additionally suggests, it's his opinion, there are others who maintain this way, that on all rabbinic mandates, women are obligated irrespective of whether it's time-bound or not. It's only on mitzvot asim in HaTorah that if it's shehazeman gerama, women are exempt. If it's rabbinic in nature, women are obligated. So those are 2 reasons that Rabbeinu Tam mentions. Ran, Rabbeinu Nisim, as we mentioned, really preceded by Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, earlier, 12th century, late 12th century Spanish rabbi, of course, at the end of his life in Israel. He suggests differently. He says it's not because of afen hayuboto hanes, it's not because of being midrabbanan, even though it's time-bound, but rather, the Gemara Masech Berachot and Daf Chaf says that anyone who's obligated in the shamor of Shabbat, in the safeguarding of Shabbat, the mitzvot lo ta'aseh of Shabbat, is also obligated in the mitzvot aseh of Shabbat, more specifically in Kiddush, right? The Torah in Parashat Yitro, when it recounts for us the Aseret HaDeberot, or I see Rani Miz here, the Aseret HaDevarim, it tells us, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadesho, right? That's the mitzvah, the mandate when it comes to Shabbat, to recall, to mention Shabbat as we understand it. In Parashat Va'etchanan, when Moshe is remembering what happened, he tells us that it's Shamor et Yom HaShabbat lekadesho. He tells us it's about safeguarding the day. Well, which one was in the on the tablets? Well, I'm not fully certain. Ramban actually wonders this. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, I've seen there's plenty written about that. We don't know exactly what was written. What did we hear? Well, the rabbis suggest that we heard both at once. In an inconceivable fashion, God, not uttered, he doesn't have vocal cords, but got into our minds both Shamor and Zachor at once. We in turn derive that anyone who's obligated in the Shamor, in the mitzvah lo ta'aseh of Shabbat, is obligated in the Aseh of Shabbat as well, which is Kiddush. Suggests Ramban, that would extend to all the mitzvot of Shabbat, including Lech HaMishneh and 3 meals. Okay, the point being, all the technicalities aside, I hope I said them succinctly and properly in that brief amount of time, is that the Rishonim, the major medieval commentators, both Spanish and French, agree that women are obligated in both the 3 meals on Shabbat and Lech HaMishneh, the 2 loaves of bread. As a result, Mishnah Berurah, fast forwarding, this Hafetz Chaim, he dies, I think, in 1933, so fast forwarding quite some time, he writes in his book, but again, it was stated over the course of time by many, but he writes it in his authoritative work on Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim in Siman Resh Lamed Daled, v'gam hanashim mechuyavot belech hamishneh shahayu gam ken b'nei saman. Right, women are as well obligated in the double portion of bread on Shabbat because they too were a part of that miracle. Fair enough, we didn't see any dissenting opinion. It comes, however, prior to Mishnah Berurah in a book called Ha'elef Lecha Shlomo. I should have showed it to you. But anyway, Rabbi Shlomo Kluger. Rabbi Shlomo Kluger was a Ukrainian 19th century important rabbi. It's interesting, I don't know the politics or the reason behind this, but in recent times there's a whole organization dedicated to publishing Rabbi Shlomo Kluger's writings, and they have, I don't know, dozens of books from him. I imagine, I could be wrong, could have done this with a lot of the great rabbis of the past. So either they had the manuscripts or they had the proper funding, whatever it is. Ha'elef Chashelomo, though, is the most notorious book of his, to my mind, and that is his She'elot Teshubot on matters of Orach Chaim. In there, I'm just going to read to you a little bit. She'elato, in Siman Kof Yod Dalet, Lama lo nahagu hanashim belech HaMishneh. So the question begins with realization. Well, the women here in, I guess, Ukraine, they're not makpid to have 2 loaves of bread or to partake in the eating from 2 loaves of bread on Shabbat. Says Rabbi Shlomo Kluger, Leda'ati, in my opinion, Minhag Yisrael Torahi. This is Minhag Yisrael, and that will establish the halacha. He goes on, he says, but wait a second, the Rishonim disagree with that. So he has issues with each of the explanations of the Rishonim. He says the afen hayuboto hanes reason, rationale of Rabbeinu Tam, not the greatest argument. That's when the mitzvah is specifically exemplifying and being mefarsim. It's showing all the miracle. Over here happens to be that the miracle inspired the mitzvah, but it's not that it's a pirsum, it's not a way of publicizing that miracle. That's what he suggests. Keep in mind, he's disagreeing. This is generally something we don't do in the halakha system, disagreeing with one of the Rishonim. And then he goes on, he deals with Ran and Ramban's argument. He says it's not Pishat in the Gemara. He concludes, V'lachen ulekach, rather, in the third paragraph, En nohagin beze ka'abu daram. Rabbi David Abu Daram stated, he quoted these Rishonim that we had in source number 1, Uminhag Yisrael Torahu. Do you follow what he just did over here? He basically just stated that the textual evidence that we have, which seems to be monolithic, it's a one-visioned description of women's obligation in Lech HaMishneh and Se'udot Shabbat, is wrong. Why is it wrong? Well, I could make logical arguments against it. Is that enough? Minhag Yisrael Torahu. Which means to say the women are not doing it. There must be something sanctified, something canonized about that way of the women's practice, that just establishes it as the proper practice. Is he the only one to state this? Just about. They've recently found this book, Sheilot Tishbot Mor Ve'aholot. I imagine he called it Mor Ve'oholos, but the Pasuk in Shir HaShirim has it as Mor Ve'aholot, right? It's a book written by this Rabbi Eliyahu Posek. He's a 19th to 20th century Ashkenazic, I think Hasidic rabbi. And he writes, Me'odi lo ra'iti shehanashim here in Siman Chaftet, in Oil Berachot Ve'odaot, shehanashim minhagu la'asol le'atzman ler hamishneh. I've just never seen such a practice. Okay, so there is verification, at least sometime, several decades after the Shlomo Kluger, that women are not practicing this. Is that generally accepted? Says Chacham Ovadia Yosef, 2 problems. Number 1, he doesn't say this explicitly. Number 1, women do have Lech HaMishneh, and women do have the 3 meals. So number 1, even though he doesn't say it, he's disputing the minhag's existence. Maybe in your communities it was different. But furthermore, and more fundamental for our purposes, he says, I don't care what the minhag is. Call it a minhag ta'ut. Explain it away as a mistake, an anomaly in our historical practice. This is not the way it's supposed to be. Go back to our sources. Ran, Ramban, Rabbeinu Tam, Mordechai, and so forth. David Abu Daram. They all tell us women should be involved in these matters. So, he first wrote about it, I think, in Yabia Omer Chelik Vav. He has it in Yahavedat here, Chelik Dalet, Siman Chaf He. I'm going to just read a little bit here in source number 5. Dvarav Timuhim Meod. He says, I don't understand Rabbi Shlomo Kluger. They're very perplexing words. Sheme'achar Rishonim shavim b'zeh. Once the Rishonim are all agreeing that שהנשים חייבות בלחם משנה בשלוש סעודות, מי ירהיב עוז לחלוק עליהם בלי טעם וראיה ברורה מהתלמוד? You're good without any solid proof? You'll quibble with their reasoning. Okay. But you don't have solid proof against them? Can't accept it. Who has the audacity, the gall to go against them? In Hazon Ovadia, his latest work on these sorts of matters, in Chelik Bet and Shabbat, on page Kuf Ayin Dalet, he goes even stronger in his wording. V'noraot nifleti echirhiv oz litchot et divrei kol gedolei haposkim. I can't understand how he had that audacity, that courage to go against all of our great ones. Hevel Nevi'im, shekulam shavim be'ikar adin shanashim hayavot shalosh seodot b'lech HaMishneh. How could you dispute something that all have always agreed? Here's the key words. They might be negating what they did in his small province, in his city. Do you think because of the strange things that take place in your community, we're going to push aside all the words of our tradition? Atmeha! Atmeha means I can't believe it. I'm questioning this reality. This is a classic example of Chacham Ovadia Yosef being 100% right in his approach on this matter. 100% right. His claim is there is no counter evidence to make the argument that women shouldn't be involved in these mitzvot. So you've realized in your community they're not. That's not enough. Again, this is how Chacham Ovadia Yosef will structure all of his Pesak Halacha. He'll always say, because a few people did it one way, doesn't mean we should change it. He won't distinguish between one community in Ukraine, several communities in Poland, and the widespread practice in Am Yisrael. He'll always say, just because they're doing that, it doesn't mean it's right. Here, he's got a point. Just because they're doing it over there, and we don't have any evidence that this was a practice for some time in several places, he certainly has the last word on this matter and would and should and does obligate women in each of these matters. It's interesting in the Hasidic world, to the best of my knowledge, the literature on this matter is in the Hasidic world today, in the last 50, 60, maybe 80 years. They've noticed that women are not present during the time of the Beracha and Hamotzi. What happens is the Rebbe will make the Beracha and then he'll send it into the adjacent room to his wife. So they'll always be eating from the bread, but they're not present during the time of Beracha, which might not be ideal, and so they kind of backtrack and say, maybe there is reasons for that being ideal. It's an interesting reality, certainly, not something we're familiar with, not sitting next to your wife at a meal, but that's the way they have it. But to the best of my knowledge, you'll have everyone agreeing, aside from these two minority sources, that women are obligated in those matters. But for us, this is a window into the world of Chacham Ovadia Yosef. It's a window. It's a world we're already familiar with, but it's again reacquainting us with that methodology. Over here, the claim is it's just those two. It's just that community. You can't run against our tradition for that. Question will be in other cases whether he can make that claim and whether others will agree with him with that sort of claim. So I bring you to the next of our case studies. So we have two more, and these are the two primary ones. The second one here is Kol Ram, or Ashkenazim would refer to it. We lost Itai? All right. Well, Ashkenazim would refer to this as the Heiche Kedusha. I won't call you Ashkenazi, Rani, all right? As you don't know Heiche Kedusha. You know Kol Ram, right? Which means to say, instead of having a regular Hazarat Hashas, well, I think a lot of us are familiar with this. The Hazan will begin the Amidah out loud when there would normally be Tfilat Lahash, and he'll get up to, Sfaradim will have the Kahal reading along with the Hazan quietly. Ashkenazim will have just the Hazan for the first three Berachot with Kedusha, with Naktishat, with Keter, whatever it is, and then Ashkenazim will then begin the Amidah, Sfaradim will then continue in the Amidah, but you've circumvented a Hazarat Hashatz, a repetition of the Amidah. Where did that come from? Is it appropriate? Of course, are always important questions. We dedicated one summer a full class to the history of this matter. Don't want to deal with the full history of this matter, but I do want to deal with specifically during Mincha, saying a Heiche Kedusha, saying Kol Ram. Now, there is, for quite some time, a well-known practice that in the yeshivot, let's call them Haredi yeshivot, both back in Europe and then in Israel and then in America, Mincha on a weekday is with Kol Ram. My father has told me many times the minyan with Rabbi Soloveitchik after the shi'ur was Kol Ram, was Heiche Kedusha. When I learned in Mir, it was Heiche Kedusha, if I remember correctly as well. It was Kol Ram. Many yeshivot of the course of time have done a Kol Ram. Nobody, here's the interesting thing, nobody knows why. In the yeshiva, that's where I understand you're doing it in the synagogue. The synagogue kids, the men are not going to be able to, the balabatim, they're not going to be able to get themselves together and keep quiet. In the yeshiva, we're supposed to be dealing with the elite, are we not? You can't trust that they're going to behave themselves during Hazarat Hashas. They don't have the patience. So there's always been a mystery when this began and why we're doing this and so forth. But for quite some time it's persisted as the minhag. So that is what we're going to address. Is it an appropriate minhag that we should continue because it had some grounding? We'll just search for the reasoning and sourcing. Or is it something that, well, if this isn't ideal, we should do away with it? That'll be the issue I want to address specifically. A brief background. Background is Bet Yosef and Siman Resh Lamed Daled. This is Rabbi Yosef Karo. He cites from Harambam in Hilchot Tefillah, this idea of having a Hazarat Hashatz in Mincha just as you would in Shachrit. He says, V'chen nohagim ha'ashkenazim. He says the German Jewry, 16th century, as well, they do Hazarat Hashatz during Mincha. Chen katava kolbo, he continues. Third line, aval hasfaradim. He's referring to, again, mid-16th century Spanish Jewry. En nohagim la hazor shliach tzibur tefillah b'mincha la mitpalel shliach tzibur im tzibur v'kol ram, and so forth. Says Bet Yosef, describing his time period, not in the yeshivas, everywhere it sounds like during Mincha, there's no Hazarat Hashas. It's Kol Ram. That's the way it's done. Continues Bet Yosef. You should know, minhag, I'm on the second to last line, 4 words before the end, minhag Ashkenazim hu anachon. The Ashkenazim, the German Jewry, they got it right. You should have a full Hazara. V'chen hinhigu hachamim shebedor shelefanenu, and he says in generation before myself, they changed this custom, or they established the custom, b'tzvat, in the city Tzvat, which is where he's living, tibaneh v'tikonem b'mera b'amenu v'gazru nidui la'over al takanatam, and they established a excommunication for anyone who won't do a full-fledged Hazarat Tashas, repetition of the Amidah during Mincha. That's an interesting history already. Everybody's familiar with the history of Harambam. Many people are familiar with the history of Harambam and Hazarat Tashatz and Kol Ram. Here, Bet Yosef is telling us that in the Spanish Sephardic world, they were not, by and large, saying a full-fledged Hazarat Tashatz ever during Mincha. In Tzvat, sounds like somewhat of a new custom there was. Says Shulchan Aruch in Siman Resh Lamed Bet, Saif Aleph, that only if the time is running late and it's absolutely necessary, can you or should you do a Kol Ram in Mincha? Otherwise, you should do a full-fledged Hazarat Tashas. Okay, so that got us from 16th century. Now we're fast-forwarding at the very least to 19th century Europe, and then beyond 20th century Europe and Israel and America, 21st century as well, a bit of that as well. Okay, so let's fast-forward again. In the yeshivas, they're not doing Hazarat Tashatz. What's taking place in the Shtiblach, in the Batei Knesiot? I don't know. It's possible yesh v'yesh. It's possible they're all doing a full-fledged Hazarat Tashatz. But in the yeshivot, they're always doing a Kol Ram in the yeshivot of Europe. It says in source number 9, She'elot Teshubot Az Nidberu Chelek Yod Bet Siman Chaf Gimel. This is Rabbi Binyamin Zilber. Rabbi Binyamin Zilber lived in Bnei Brak for much of his life, not all of his life. He passed away, I think, in 2008. He was one of the Gedolei HaPoskim of our generation, I would say. He deals with this matter. He was asked about the minhag in the yeshivot, that they don't say a Hazarat Tashatz. So he begins by restating what he wrote earlier, that it's important to have Hazarat Tashatz and that you should do away with this minhag. And then he says, you know something? I like this line. Where is it? The fourth line in source number 9, fourth line after the ellipsis. V'lomrot shani yeshivater. Even though I'm a yeshiva guy, ben im memale tafkido lo, whether I have a job in a yeshiva or not, I don't think he did. I think he was a posek halakha. I don't know what else he did, but he didn't work in a yeshiva. Bechol zot lo hita'alamti mahanegi'ah. Nonetheless, the fact that I was attached to the yeshiva, I didn't let that bias me and say, oh, we should keep it as no hazara. I said, lo tisa penei ish. I'm not going to favor the yeshiva system and let them continue with a wrongful, crooked minhag. They should be doing hazarat tashatz through and through. Then he continues. That's my old writing. Aval ad 40 shana in adam omed al da'at rabo. The truth is, the Gemara says, it takes you 40 years to appreciate and understand your rabbi's words, your mentor's messages and lessons. It took me time, and I absorbed this, and I came to a conclusion that maybe there is a grounding and a good reason for, in the yeshiva, not doing Hazarat Tashas during Mincha. Now, he doesn't say that you must do it that way, but he says, I can understand that there's something nice about one person doing it for all. Maybe we can make an understanding that there's no Hazarat Tashatz, and each person individually has the full-fledged Amidah. That's the statement of Rabbi Zilber. So he's somewhat equivocal. He has a respect for the system. He's willing to overthrow it. He does overthrow other things in interesting contexts, which we could talk about separately, but that's a statement in this context. Moving this forward in terms of the connectedness to the tradition, to the mimetic tradition, to what at some point developed and holding tight to it, in the book Meged Givot Olam in Chelik Bet. This is written by Rabbi Michal Shurkin from Yeshivas Toras Moshe. So he tells the following story. He says that he heard from someone who studied in Yeshivat Hadera when Rav Shach was there. I'm going to leave the biography of Rav Shach out. He didn't belong there. It was his cousin-in-law's yeshiva, Rabbi Issar Zalman Meltzer's son's yeshiva. So he was there during this time period. It was a Zionistic yeshiva. He was far from being a Zionist. I heard from someone who studied there at the time that Rav Shach, who's renowned for being a strong, full-fledged Haredi Rosh Yeshiva and leader, he walked into the classroom at one point with gloves on and a Zionist, a newspaper newspaper, and he picked it up and he burnt it over the garbage can, and then he burnt his gloves just to make the point that this is pasul. So anyway, that's just Rav Shach in Chadera. Of course, he makes his way to Panovich Yeshiva, which was really a place that was very appropriate for someone of his nature, of his character traits. Anyway, the story that's told over here goes as follows. There was a young man in Chadera Yeshiva who said to him, Rabbi, how come we do Kol Ram during Mincha? Maybe it's inappropriate. Maybe we have more time and we're able to, at the very least on Friday afternoons when there are two minyanim, apparently there was one earlier minyan and one later minyan. Maybe since the later minyan is not really connected, the earlier minyan was after we finished learning in the morning. The later minyan is connected to Shabbat. It's not part of the yeshiva system. Maybe in that circumstance we should, add a full-fledged Hazarat Hashatz. You got to respect this individual. He's looking for Hazara. Anyway, Rav Shach responded to him as the story goes, En sorech lihiyot yoter frumer me'hafetz hayim. There's no necessity for us to be more religious than the Hafetz Hayim. Hafetz Hayim, of course, being the Mishnah Berurah, Rabbi Israel Meir Kagin of Radin, right? It says, if this is what the Hafetz Hayim had in his yeshiva, if this is what the system is, we're looking to be more religious. That's fundamentally speaking to the mimetic tradition. I can't explain to you why the Hafetz Hayim did this, basically Rav Shach is saying. I can't necessarily rationalize it, but this is the way we do it, and that is appropriate for us. In the book Emet Li'Yaakov is the author of it, although he didn't publish this in his lifetime, was Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky was a towering American personality in terms of the yeshiva system, Piskei Halacha. He dies in 1986. He looks for a rationale. It's brought in a footnote to the book. So and it says at the end, Mipi HaShimua. So this wasn't written by him, but apparently he had expressed this. If I'm not mistaken, the book is published by Rabbi Daniel Neustadt, who I think is his grandson. So, that doesn't mean that he didn't misquote it. But anyway, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky looked for a rationale, which means to say, again, he accepts this is the way we do it. In the yeshivas, mincha, there's kol ram. What's the reason for it? Well, it's a cute reason. And I don't know if it's the absolute real reason, quote unquote, for how this began. He suggests that in synagogues, classically, you had people who didn't know how to pray. Hazarat Hashatz initially was instated for those who didn't know how to pray. So as a result, it's appropriate for a synagogue. In a Beit Midrash, what are you doing there? You're studying Torah. You're not a beginner. We imagine you're someone who knows how to pray. As a result, it's inappropriate for you. It was never instated or never appropriately instated in the Beit Midrash, and that's why specifically in the yeshivot and in a yeshiva, it's appropriate for there not to be Hazarat Hashatz during Mincha on a consistent basis. Again, each of these rabbis, as we've been developing them, stating this is what exists. Don't be more religious than the Hafetz Hayim. Let me try to find for you a rationale. Let me explain to you how this came about. Okay, these sources, until now, I actually was familiar with. It's just 3 weeks ago, I got this book, or maybe 2 weeks ago, I got this book. It's Masoret Moshe Helek Daled. I think it was just published about a month ago. Anyway, what this book, Masoret Moshe, is, these are the notebooks of Rabbi Mordechai Tendler. I think we've mentioned this book on several occasions. Rabbi Mordechai Tendler is the grandson of Rav Moshe Feinstein. And he wrote he wrote down things he heard specifically, and he was Mishamish, his grandfather, for many years. He wrote them down, and they've been published in one after another in the last couple of years. This one just recently published. So in here, it tells the following. It's in Masoret Moshe, Helek Dalet, page Lamed Gimel through Lamed Dalet. It tells the following. It says that I was speaking to my grandfather, and I asked him about this minhag, in this way that in the yeshivot they do kol ram during mincha every single day. And I asked him, did you see that in the yeshivas when you were in Europe? By Rabbi Zalman Meltzer, by others? And said Rav Moshe Feinstein, I don't remember such a thing. I don't think so. I think in the yeshivas that I studied at in Europe, we used to say Hazarat Hashatz. Maybe this was a Polish yeshiva thing. I'm not really certain. He says, the grandson says, I explained to him there are two reasons people give for why in the yeshivot they don't have full-fledged Hazarat Hashatz. Either Bitul Torah, I'm sure he says or said, Bitul Torah. It's going to take away from Torah, not worth prayer. Let's spend more time on tefillah. Alternatively, the reason is maybe people aren't going to be focused just in the yeshiva, so it's going to be beracha levatala. He says, my grandfather dismissed both of those explanations. So it means that Rav Moshe Feinstein, again, who's the Rosh Yeshiva of MTJ, Mesivta Tiferet Yerushalayim, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, he's got his yeshiva in place. The reasons given for this minhag, he doesn't know. The minhag in his own life, he doesn't remember. What's he doing in the study hall of his yeshiva? The answer is Kol Ram. Kol Ram, the grandson turns to him and says, Zaidi, he says, Grandpa, I don't understand why you're doing this. You told me you can't understand the reason. You told me in the yeshivot that you're familiar with in Europe, they didn't have this minhag. So why are you doing it? So answers Rav Moshe Feinstein, this is a minhag, was with Nityased, it was established by Gedolim. He says, Zaidi, which Gedolim? He said, I don't know. The previous generation. He says, the previous generation in America? He said, no, it's got to be the previous generation in Europe. He said, but you never saw it in Europe. He says, yeah, but I know that they did this there, and as a result, I am not comfortable. I will not allow for this practice to change. And even in my study hall, in my Beit Midrash, in MTJ, we're going to do Kol Ram every single day for Mincha. That is Rav Moshe Feinstein at his best. He's literally stating, I can't come up with a reason. I didn't even experience this minhag on my own, but I know this is the minhag, Kihila Kadisha, Minhag Yisrael Torahu. As a result, we're going to keep this minhag. It's convenient that it's lekula. You would imagine maybe that's the way he leans. He doesn't always lean lekula. I think he leans with Minhag Yisrael. What is
that? The two reasons: one, that's berachot levatala, and two, that it's for people who don't know how to pray.
He didn't like either one of them. The one that it's for people who didn't know how to pray, they didn't suggest him. They gave him the reason that it's either that the berachot levatala or it's bitul Torah. The people who don't know how to pray was Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky. The point is, he didn't know a reason. There's another paragraph in which he deliberates on the matter or whatever. I gave you an ellipsis over there. He has no reason. At least with his grandson, he never sets forth a reason. In the conversation, he unabashedly says to his grandson, to Rabbi Tendler, I don't know the reason for this. I don't even know where it started. I do know this is the minhag and this is what we're going to keep. To the extent that, keep in mind, and he's well aware of Maran Resh Lamed Daled, that in Svat they were Gozer Nidui, an excommunication, if you did away with Hazara. He's well aware that there's strong rationale in the Kabbalistic world to keep Hazara, as we've discussed in other classes. Nonetheless, he says in the Yeshivot, this is our minhag. It's an American minhag, his grandson says. No, we do it in America, but it's from Europe. Where? Don't know. Maybe Poland. That's the statement. It's a fascinating statement, in my opinion. Hacham Ovadia Yosef, and you couldn't have scripted this one better. Around the same time period, I imagine, Yahavedat Helekim Siman Tetzayin. Here's the question posed to him. Hayim, or he poses to himself, Hayim yesh simuchim. Is there anything to lean on? La minhag shel eze yeshivot mesuyamot. First and foremost, to some specific yeshivot. What do you mean some specific yeshivot? Certainly I presented it to you, to the best of my knowledge. It's the widespread yeshivot. Okay. The widespread minhag. Regardless, he says, Shemitpalim b'derech klal, they generally speaking, tfilat mincha mekuseret, b'li hazarat hashaliach sibor. Is there any rationales, any grounding for that minhag? So, of course, we know what's going to happen here. Hacham Vadia Yosef is going to get sourced. He's going to get textual. So that's indeed what he does. I mean, I skipped the beginning. He goes to the Gemara Masech Rosh Hashanah. He goes to Harambam. He deals with each one of the sources. And then he brings us forward to the matter at hand. He quotes from a book called Batei Knesiot in Kuntres Bait Maleh. He'ela she'afilu im haya minhag kavua litpalel b'mincha tefillah. Tefillah ehad, it should say, or tefillah ahat, even if the minhag in your specific location is to do one prayer, in other words, no hazara, yesh levatel minhagam, do away with that minhag. It's a wrong held minhag. Velo nomar bezeh minhag mivatel halacha. You may not say the minhag does away with halacha. It's wrongful. He goes onward. He makes the counterclaim to what, of course, we were mentioning earlier. He says, the yeshivot, you couldn't find finer individuals than there. They're going to listen. They're going to pay attention. They're going to be attentive. They're going to do hazara properly. Don't you dare take it away from them. And if your yeshiva is doing kol ram, hechi kedusha, and mincha, do away with that change of bisikum. Choba kedosha mutelet al rashi yeshivot lehahazir atara liyoshna. It's an absolute obligation, important, stringent obligation on the heads of the yeshivas, restore the crown to its full glory. fascinating reality over here. This is Chacham Vadia Yosef at his best, Rav Moshe Feinstein at his best. They're squaring off on this sort of matter. What's the sort of matter? We have a textual tradition, we have a rationale that we understand better based on our sources, running up against what has been practiced for some time. We can't pinpoint where it began, but has been practiced for some time. And Chacham Vadia Yosef, true to his word, as his son Chacham David writes in Orchot Maran, Chelek Aleph, in source number 14, on page Shin Chav Zayin, was makpid. Now, he didn't have a yeshiva per se, his sons did, but he was makpid. Minyan, he would pray, and for Mincha, they always had Hazarat Hashatz. So what we've developed, or we've understood again, is Chacham Vadia Yosef and changing what we do. Here's a primary example. He's interested, he's maybe even persuasive in changing what had been, at that point already, a fine-greased minhag, something that everyone was practicing, or many were practicing within that context of a yeshiva. He says, absolutely not. No minhag mevatel halacha. Wrongful minhag, wrongful halacha. Lastly, in terms of our... Yes, Ronnie?
Talking
Eddie.
about Ashkenaz yeshivot, were the Sephardic yeshivot doing the same?
I don't know. I'm not so certain there were so many of that sort of Sephardic yeshivot, and those are for dealing with Middle Eastern world. I do know he's familiar with what's taking place. So whatever's being posed to him, he says that it exists in some yeshivot. He doesn't distinguish. I understand the question, and again, what I'm saying is he doesn't distinguish. He doesn't say, well, the Ashkenazic yeshivot, I know they have their Masorah, so we're going to do it differently. He doesn't do that. But I do understand that there is a different cultural phenomenon for him. Yes, Ronnie?
Yeah, there's the second quote that you bring up that seems to show a different pattern in the way they do Kol Ram.
Indeed,
Right?
indeed.
So right, and I noticed it when you said it first by I think Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, right, where there was an inyan of Samchut Geulah Tefillah, right. So the way we know to do Kol Ram is that the Sibur is saying the first three brachot along with the Chazan.
You proved yourself, Ronnie. You are a Sfaradi. You proved it. Ashkenazim don't do it that way. Ashkenazim have just the Hazan while the Kahal is quiet. Then they do Naktishach or Keter or Nekadesh, and then they begin the Amidah afterwards. So there is a problem for Ashkenazim of Simichut Geulah Litfilah, as Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky.
It's a very simple
just
text.
to do it our way. Just to do it the Sephardi way.
And you have here you have Hamovadia, right, bringing it up that's the way it was done also.
It seems clear if you read it. Yeah. It seems clear. Right. So there were, and certainly are today, different ways of doing Kol Ram over the course of time. Today, to the best of my knowledge, it's just split like that. Ashkenazim will, by and large, not read it together as the Hazan is doing it. Sfaradim will. It's a quick fix to Shahrit, Rani, because his issue was specifically in Shaharit. Even Sfaradim, how often do you see a Kol Ram in Shaharit? It's usually in Musaf. His rationale, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky said, there would be
I'm on Zoom with Sephardic. I'm seeing all sorts of...
Okay, I'm sorry, I don't know. I don't know. This was not an anti-Sephardic statement. I don't know what's done.
Which I never saw.
Right. That's something else.
The same thing when they're watching you on Zoom, Ronnie. So
Right.
don't worry about it.
Right.
Don't worry.
Yeah.
I'm not cutting them off yet.
Yeah.
There's a minyan in the OU. There's this one minyan in the OU that I pray at sometimes with this old school. He's like a Rebbe. He's got to be, God bless, in his high 70s, 80. He teaches a daf, and after that, every single time, it's Kol Ram.
Kol Ram?
But it's the only minyan in the whole place that's Kol Ram still.
But they're going to be makpid, safeh, minhag Yisrael Torahu.
Yeah.
So now you can tell them about Geulah.
But again, Ronnie, that's only going to be in Shachrit, the Smichut Geulah Litfilah. Yeah. All right. Last of our case studies will be, I guess, most relevant to the upcoming holiday, to any holiday really, and that is whether to say the Berachav Shehyanu, I generally refer to a woman, as she's lighting candles before the holiday. There once was, and maybe some would still consider it a question, whether women should make any beracha on lighting candles for a holiday. Harambam does not mention it. It is mentioned, however, in several of the later poskim, and Shulchan Aruch seems to embrace it as we understand it. And in turn, the question is, okay, we can, and generally I think, assume that women, some won't because of Harambam, that women make a beracha on the hadlakat nerot of Yom Tov. Should they at that same juncture say a beracha of Shehiyanu? So I'm not sure how to base this. Not going to deal too much with logic, going to deal with technicalities and sourcing on this matter. So we're going to begin with source number 15, which is one of the, if not the earliest source on this matter, and that is Or Zarua. Or Zarua we've mentioned in the past. He's a product of Chachmei Ashkenaz, of Hasidei Ashkenaz in Siman Yod Aleph. He's an Austrian 13th century rabbi. He says, Ve'amrinan perek haro'eh ba'Yerushalmi. He's citing not from our Talmud. Our Talmud has no mention of beracha for hadlakat nerot of Yom Tov, nor does it have any mention of Shehiyanu, of course, either. It says over there, it says in Talmud Yerushalmi, which we don't have exactly as he's stating it, but this is his Talmud Yerushalmi. Hamadlik ner belele Yom Tov, a person, a woman, a man who lights candle on Erev Yom Tov, mevarech, says, Omer, sheksham s'tav tzvana ladlik ner lichvod Yom Tov. Okay, I don't even think that's the nosach that it is, right? Okay. Ve'en sarich lomar, and you do not need to say zeman. You don't need to say the beracha of Shehiyanu. Zeman refers to the new time that we're entering into, meaning Shehiyanu. Okay, so that being, if that's what it says in Talmud Yerushalmi, it's explicit that you don't say Ziman. Alternatively, it doesn't say it in his Yerushalmi, it just says to make the beracha of Lahadlik Ner, or Lahadlik Ner Lichvod, and it doesn't mention Shehiyanu and Or Zarua is injecting that, but in the earliest of our sources, of course an Ashkenazic source, he's stating unequivocally, do not say Shehiyanu at that time period. Why wouldn't you say Shehiyanu? Of course, the husband, or whoever's making Kiddush, will say Shehiyanu at the first meal of the holiday, and therefore you'll be Yotzeh with that Shehiyanu. In the book Leket Yosher is written by Terumat Hadesh and Rabbi Israel Isserlin. He's also a German rabbi, but later, a 15th century German rabbi. Ashmi'ina nameh de la mevarech zeman. You're not supposed to say the zeman Shehiyanu. V'im yesh nashim shenoagod levarech zeman b'yom tov, lashmi'a li kelomar la sevira li, ela kemo shekatav Or Zarua. He agrees with the rabbi who preceded him several hundred years with Or Zarua. Women should not be saying Shehiyanu. The fact already that he's writing about it at this point, several hundred years later, already seems to tip us off to the fact that maybe women are saying the beracha. Is not explicit about that. Fast forward now to 18th century Germany. Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Rabbi Yaakov Emden talks about the fact that his wife is saying the beracha of Shehiyanu, and he can't really understand why she's saying Shehiyanu. He says, we're going to say Shehiyanu later on. Why are you saying Shehiyanu? Honey, rohi, I don't know how to say that in Ashkenazis. Whatever, he's in German. Whatever he says to her, I don't know why you're saying Shehiyanu, but he backs off, he writes in the Teshuvah. He says that some sort of minhag. I can't say it's specifically wrong, beracha levatala per se, but I'm not so familiar with the reason to do it there. You could say Shehiyanu at any point. Why are they doing it in that juncture? In the third paragraph, Al ken amarti le'atzmi, as I therefore said to myself, Hanach lahen minhagan, shehu Yerusha lahen me'avotehen. They received this from their fathers, maybe from their mothers. Ve'asu ken bifnei gedolei olam. They must have done this in front of great men and women as well. Ubiychud, okay, and specifically our situation. V'ilad dehazia lebe nasha la'abda. Im omnam lo nodali mahaya da'ato shel avi mori hagaon hasid. His father, Chacham Tzvi, Rabbi Tzvi Ashkenazi, who was a great and towering posek, he said, I'm not certain what they did. I'm not certain what my mother or father did. V'tov be'inai levarech im hayiti moseh sa'ad u'semech b'divrei ha-poskim zal. He said, I just looking for some mention in the poskim, in the rishonim, and Gemara, something that it's appropriate, or that it's right, or that there is a minhag. I see this as what's being done. I'm not going to abolish it. Can't really understand it, and I wish I could come up for a reason, with a source or a reason. He writes, I'm not really able to find something solid on this matter. So that's bringing us forward to the discussion of this Shehayanu. Again, what would the issue, let's pause for a second and ask what the issue would be with saying Shehayanu. The issue with saying Shehayanu would potentially be the following. It's hard to argue it'll be a beracha levatala. It is appropriate to say Shehayanu. It's when the husband, or whoever's saying Kiddush at the meal, then says the beracha of Shehayanu. Should the woman say Amen then? We fear it's going to be a hefsek if she says Amen. She already said Amen. Maybe she shouldn't. Maybe that's why she shouldn't say it before. And that's really a technical issue. We're not dealing with earth-shattering issues over here. We are dealing with, and it's again, I repeat, that the time of candlelighting, for good reason. I mentioned last week how on the tombstones of Kohanim, there's the picture of the hands because that's what we most associate Kohanim with for one reason or another. On the tombstones of many women, you'll see a picture of lighting candles, or of candlesticks, or of closing their eyes as they light the candles. This is such a focal, sentimental, emotional moment in women's lives, in a Jewish home's life over the course of hundreds and thousands of years, entering into holidays and Shabbat. To play with the practice or to discuss the practice, in my mind, is very sensitive. So when we did the class on when to make the beracha, how Chacham Ovadia Yosef, without any fear, changes that. I mentioned that. It took a lot of audacity for him to do so. I say it here as well. If women are making berachav shehayanu on the hadlakat nerot of Yom Tov, if that's what they learned from their mother, if that's what they've been doing, to go ahead and say, don't do that any longer on a mitzvah, which is specifically theirs in our historical memory, and they've been doing it that way, that's not simple. It's to a certain extent what Rabbi Yaakov Emden was saying about his wife. If you recall, I told you that's what Rabbi Mazuz said about when to make the beracha with his wife. He said, I agree with Chacham Ovadia Yosef, but I'm kind of not going to mess with my wife. Yes, ma. Yes, Ima. One second. You're muted. You're muted. Click unmute. Got it.
Okay. That was a very hard thing for me when I got married.
With the order of the berachot. I know.
To say Shehayanu.
Oh, the Shehayanu as well. Oh, no kidding. Oh, so I'm not sure if you want to listen to the continuity of this class. to the continued progress. Oh, okay. So
emotional. It was very emotional.
As I can only imagine. I mean it.
Validating your point.
Right. So moving forward, and we're moving into 19th century, a place called Navardik, a great posek of the 19th century, known as Aruch HaShulchan, Rabbi Yechiel Michal Epstein. He writes, Keshem shebeshabbat misuvim hadlakat nerot and siman resh samech gimal kemochen b'yom tov. First and foremost, you should know there's an obligation, in the words of Harambam, to light candles on holiday, just like on Shabbat. Okay, what's the beracha? Lachen siricha levarech. This is Talmud Yerushalmi. Shegzam Zvanu. Ladlik ner shel Yom Tov. That, to the best of my knowledge, not like we saw earlier. Lichvot. It's shel Yom Tov. Hamordechi va'or zarua v'hagahot maimoniot. Three strong German rabbis. Heviu zem Yerushalmi. They cite it from Talmud Yerushalmi. Says Aruch HaShulchan. I don't know where that Yerushalmi is. Okay. Nashim shelanu, he writes in the third paragraph. Mevarchot gam shehayanu be'et hadlakat nerot b'Yom Tov. Ve'en limchot biyadam. And limchot biyadam means don't protest. Now, the fact that he has to tell you don't protest means you could have and should have reason to protest. But he says, don't. The al pirov be'erev Yom Tov madlikin le'et erev mamash k'ayeh shehayanu al Yom Tov. You have to understand, they're making the beracha on Yom Tov. V'yesh mefakbekim b'zeh. Some are uncertain whether it's appropriate for them to say hanach lahen libnot Yisrael min hagan. Now, I don't think he's saying necessarily emotionally it's too hard. I think he is saying this is a minhag, and a minhag has a certain sanctity and acceptance just because that what is practice. Says Mishnah Berurah, likewise, same time period. And sarich levarech zeman ala adlaka. It's unnecessary to say shehayanu. Miu b'makom shenahagu. Those women who do say shehayanu. And limchot be'adam. Don't protest. Ben Ish Hai. bringing it across countries now to Baghdad around the same time period. Ben Ish Hai, if I'm not mistaken, dies in 1909. Birkat Shehayanu b'Kiddush halayla in Parashat Memidbar. Sarich levarech b'shte leilot. Okay, I have to say Shehayanu in Kiddush on both nights. Upo irenu Baghdad noagim hanashim levarech Shehayanu b'adlakat nerot b'chol yom tov sheyesh bo birkat Shehayanu b'Kiddush. This is the women in Baghdad. The minhag is they say Shehayanu when they light the candles. Rav Moshe Feinstein, where's he? Oh, come on, we know exactly where he's going to fall on this matter. Says Rav Moshe Feinstein in Orach Hayim and Ogrot Moshe Halek Dal Siman Kof Aleph Bidvar minhagenu shaisha mevarechet zman biyom tov. He begins on the matter of our minhag, that women say Shehayanu when they light candles. Are they then allowed to say Amen to the husband as he says Kiddush at the meal on Yom Tov? The question was not about whether to say Shehayanu. Of course they should. Why should they? Because that's what they do. The question only is, should you say Amen, or is it a hefsek? Hine Pashuti writes in the second paragraph, Shelidina en safek, dehaze meot b'shanim shanashim varchot zman b'sha'a shemadlikin et nerot b'yom tov. What's the proof that women should be saying Shehayanu? They've been doing it for hundreds of years. That's proof. The proof is in the pudding. It's in the reality that this is our mimetic tradition. His specific argument is that even saying Amen then to the Shehayanu would not constitute a hefsek. And now he says, I think the reason is. Chacham Vadia Yosef would never talk like this. He'd say, what's my reasoning? And that's my pesak. He says, this is my wife does. My mother did. My grandmother did. Of course, you make Shehayanu and you say Amen. Let me figure out the reason now. Maybe the reason it's a kalush, it's a weak reason. Maybe the reason is since for the mekadesh it's an appropriate beracha, so she's saying amen to the beracha which is appropriate for the mekadesh, even though she doesn't need that beracha herself because she already said shehayanu. All right, we discussed this when we discussed matters of saying beracha or amen to berachot that you're not obligated in. When we talked about halil on Rosh Chodesh with or without a beracha, but that's the statement of Rav Moshe Feinstein. No surprises, but just again a demonstration of the mimetic tradition, the Minhag Yisrael Torahu, Minhag Mevatel Halacha, reigning supreme. Tzitz Eliezer, Chelek Yodal, Tziman Nun Gimal. Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Waldenberg, from the Ashkenazic great poskim of Yerushalayim, died, if I'm not mistaken, in 2006. Al Devar Minhag Anashim Levarech Birkat Shehayanu B'Adlakat Nero Shel Yom Tov. On that matter that they say Shehayanu, Has v'Shalom Lerafot Et Yadeh. Do not, by any call, at any cost, tell them not to make the beracha. Absolutely. Not only should you not protest, as we saw earlier, let them keep tightly, hold steadfast to your minhag. That's what your mother did. That's what you should be doing as well. We're not playing with minhagim. Aval ma'aseh on the second, on the next paragraph on page 6, ze lo rak minhag nashim bilvad. You should know this is not just a womenly minhag, which was practiced out of some sort of, insufficient knowledge. Ki galui ve'yadua shenesheu benot geoneh ugdelei adorot nahagu ken bifnehem v'al pi horaotehem. This was practiced in front of and by the ruling of some of the greatest halachic deciders. Gam afilu, in the last paragraph, etzel achenu hasfaradim mekomot sheyesh bezeh. He says even amongst the Sfaradim there are some places where some people from specific places who say shehayanu and others who don't. And as we've mentioned, Rabbi Waldenberg was well aware of Sfaradi practices and people in Yerushalayim during his time period, which means to say another one of these poskim who are strong to their word and to their approach, methodologically speaking. If this is the way it's been done, we can figure out the reason, but we know this is the right practice. He attributes it not only to Ashkenazic women, but to many Sfaradi women. We saw that in Ben Ish Hai as well. Or Letzion, Halegima, that's Cham Ben Zion Abba Shaul, the former Rosh Yeshiva of Porat Yosef, he's a contemporary of Chacham Ovadia Yosef, his neighbor for many years, Havruta, when they were younger. He dies, if I'm not mistaken, in 1998. Ha'ima Nash in Perek Yot Het Ot Bet Mivarchot Shehayanu B'Adlakat Nerot B'Yom Tov. Should they say Shehayanu when they do the berach, when they light candles? Nashima noagot levarech Birkat Shehayanu B'Adlakat Nerot Shayot Amshich Minhagan. He said if there are women who already say Shehayanu, let them continue. If they don't and they're asking, tell them maybe they shouldn't. He's consistent. We know he did this with the beracha before lighting candles as well. Allow for the minhag to continue. If someone doesn't have a minhag, if someone is looking to develop a minhag, then we should be textual. Otherwise, leave the minhag as it is. There's something to adjust by means of just by the virtue of the fact that it's been practiced in such a fashion. Chacham Ovadia Yosef, as we conclude this matter, was asked this issue in Yehavedat Hilakim Siman Medalet. And what's his response? Of course, let's go to the very last paragraph. Nashim shenagu levarech sheyachiyanu be'et hadakat nerot shel Yom Tov en minagan kol yesod b'halacha. The women who do it, there's no grounding in halacha. V'nachon sheyichavenu latzet yedei chovat bekat sheyachiyanu b'kiddush shel Yom Tov. They shouldn't be saying it then. They should hear their husband later on. K'takanat chachamim. That was the established minhag. He says in the middle there, he quotes from Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Doesn't tell you the full story in Rabbi Yaakov Emden. He says Rabbi Yaakov Emden didn't know where this minhag came from. Says Chacham Ovadia Yosef, if only he knew that Or Zarua and Leket Yosha, our earliest sources, say that they shouldn't do it, he'd be so excited. Would he then tell his wife not to? I think not. He'd still maintain this is what they're doing. I understand that I don't understand it. He threw and threw. He says, let's say a woman did go against my ruling and said Shechianu, tell her not to say Amen during the time of Kiddush. Was that always the minhag? I can't tell you, but what I can tell you is Chacham Ovadia Yosef again is consistent and true to his word. Textual tradition against all else. This was pointed out not by me. This is pointed out by Professor Rabbi Benny Lau in his book Mimaran Ad Maran, which is his dissertation on Chacham Ovadia Yosef on page 207. Benigud la poskim Ashkenazim usfaradim shekadmuhu. In negation, in contrast to the Sephardic and Ashkenazic poskim who preceded him, we can say, and his contemporaries. Motzeh harav Ovadia lenachon le'arer al minhag anashim lemrot shekach kiblu mi'imotein b'meshech torot rabim. Even though this was a practiced, well-foundationed minhag from their mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers, says Chacham Ovadia Yosef, as we noticed, as we realized, so what? Now, he's not the only. There are, even in the Ashkenazic world, this, I call it, new approach to halacha. Professor Chaim Soloveitchik would call it the breakdown of the traditional community, which brought forth different approaches to halacha. But the current Ra'avad of Edah Haredit, Badat Edah Haredit, Rabbi Moshe Sternbuch, stays in his mid-90s, maybe 93, 94 years old today. He, in his book on Shavuot, at least in the Likutei Teshubot V'Hanagot on Shavuot, states, you want to know something? The women who say Shehayanu and lighting the candles shouldn't do so. Stop them from doing so. So there is, you'll find, at times, some Ashkenazic, maybe their peripheral poskim, who will disagree. Rabbi Herschel Schachter has said about Teshubot V'Hanagot that Rabbi Sternbuch just seems to be a chock full of humrot opposed to different preconceived and accepted minhagim. He proves it over here. But before we conclude with the halacha l'maaseh, I just review for you again this last case study. Last case study being the question of whether to say shehayanu for a woman as she lights candles. There seems to be that the earliest sources we have say do not. They are Ashkenazic sources. They do not. They're quoting from some Talmud Yerushalmi, which we don't appear to have. The development at some point over time is that women did. What do we do now? Say the majority of Sephardic and certainly Ashkenazic poskim, let the women continue. Says Chacham Ovadia Yosef, true to his word, Minhag Yisrael is not Torah. It's a mistake over here specifically. What's the Halabiya Minhag for you, Jeffrey? As always, in Derech Eretz, this book by Rabbi Avraham Ades, he writes, Hanashim enan mevarchot shehayanu b'sha'at hadakat hanirot be'erev hachag. So Ima Abba was right in telling you in terms of at least the last generation of, I don't know what Syrians did all the way back. This is quoted from Rabbi Yitzhak Tawil. Chacham Yitzhak Tawil just passed away, I think, in the last 50 or so days. Chacham Yitzhak Tawil was the son of Chacham Moshe Tawil, if it's the same one, who was one of the later chief rabbis in Halab. Chacham Yitzhak Tawil, there are many videos online of him doing ma'amat and doing the different minhagim and describing the Halabiya minhagim. That's what he writes. He writes that the minhag of the women, at least in Aleppo, was not to say shehayanu, and he gives the rationale and the descriptions that we've had in terms of the reason underlying not saying that berachav shehayanu, even though it's hard, if not impossible, to make the case that it's actually a beracha levatala. What we do in this class, similar to what we've of course done in the past, and specifically in the class that we dedicated to Chacham Ovadia Yosef the first time around on changing what we do, we just brought several more case studies, primary cases, central cases to practice the issue of mincha in yeshivot and hazarat hashatz, the issue of whether shehayanu should be said during hadakat nerot. We noticed that in each of these circumstances there were minhagim that stretched back hundreds of years. Many of the poskim struggled. How do we uphold it? We should uphold it. How do we uphold it? We certainly should uphold it. We're not going to be more frum or more religious, as Rav Shach said, than the Hafetz Chaim, Minhag Yisrael, Torahu. It's going to be Minhag Mevatel Halacha. Let's just figure out how. Whereas Chacham Ovadia Yosef, similar to where he rightfully does so, without a doubt, in the context of Rabbi Shlomo Kluger. Rabbi Shlomo Kluger says, but my community doesn't. I'm not going to change the fact that the women don't do Lechem Mishneh. Says Chacham Ovadia Yosef, of course you should. Okay, over there we understand, but what about when it's a widespread, long practice custom? He's consistent in his textual approach to matters, whereas many oppose him and favor instead this mimetic tradition. Who's right, ultimately speaking? Of course, it's too hard to take such a stance or determine that matter. In my mind, as I think I've demonstrated time and again, the trajectory of halacha throughout the generations has generally speaking, not always, generally speaking, favored that mimetic tradition. As a matter of fact, that book I quoted last week, somewhere in the room, that book on Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach makes the point that in his works you'll find this through and through. He always follows the practiced custom. He says he grew up in Yerushalayim. The Yerushalmi minhagim never underwent some sort of breakdown. In other words, if you were exiled from Europe, exiled from Halab or whatever, you come to a new community and you have to reestablish and bring forth new minhagim. Maybe now I'll get textual. But if you're stuck in a place and you kind of were reared there and your minhagim stretch back some time, that's how you're going to continue. Chacham Ovadia Yosef, of course, is dealing with a generation post-expulsion and resettling in Eretz Yisrael. He has an opportune time to turn back to the sources. Rav Moshe Feinstein could have gone that way as well. He instead reverted back or continued that general mimetic tradition approach to matters. But again, did Chacham Ovadia Yosef change what we do? Absolutely. Are we excited about it? On the one hand, certainly. We are excited always when we see a dynamic side to halakha. Is there a detriment to it? I believe so as well, because in my own understanding of how halakha works, it makes it, in an ironic sense, it makes it a little bit more static, because it means that if the sources can't support fully, or if the sources point in a different direction, then you can't really develop this halakha with the times and with the community. So there, of course, are two sides to anything, this matter not any different. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.